We have with us tonight a person far, far away. She's from Ohio, state of Ohio, Jeri Diehl-Cusack. Jeri's lifelong interest in U.S. presidents and their first ladies inspires her to share her insights and knowledge after retiring from a career with public libraries in Cuyahoga County. I think I got that right. Okay, Columbus and Grandview Heights, Ohio. Wherever she travels, she seeks out presidential homes, libraries, museums, birthplaces, summer White Houses, memorials, burial sites, and other historical significant locations. Jeri served for 5 years on the board of the Eleanor Roosevelt Val-Kill Partnership, an organization committed to preserving Mrs. Roosevelt's cottage home in Hyde Park, New York. She's a proud supporter of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Library, Presidential Library, I should say, through the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute, and a lifelong member of Arthur Dale Heritage Incorporated, which maintains Eleanor's Little Village in Arthur Dale, West Virginia. Jeri's an active member of the White House Historical Association and the Ohio History Connection. Jeri currently offers presentations on about 40 presidential and White House history topics. Discussions on both Franklin and Eleanor are her specialty. She enjoys teaching lifelong learning classes and sharing enrichment programs with a variety of audiences throughout Ohio. Now you can add New York to your list. A former trustee of her local library and Historical Association and Arts Council in Grandview Heights, Jeri moved to Worthington, Ohio in 2019 in order to live closer and to make memories with her children and grandchildren. She dedicates her volunteer efforts to Central Ohio Chapter for Alzheimer's Association, while fundraising for her Walk to the End ALZ team, Hurry Up Cure. Her motto is a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt: "Do one thing every day that scares you." Okay, please welcome Jeri Diehl-Cusack.
Thank you, Barbara. And if there's nothing scarier today than speaking in front of folks that live right around the corner from the FDR Presidential Library and Museum and Springwood and Val-Kill and Top Cottage, but I decided we could give this a go. Barbara asked me if I could share one of my programs, and we decided you might like to hear about some of the Roosevelt women. I did an entire lifelong learning class earlier this summer with 5 different segments about the Roosevelt women, as you see on my opening slide here, the women who helped shape Eleanor Roosevelt's life. And I have pictures here of Eleanor as a teenager, I believe, but also, whoops, come on, behave. There we go, as a young girl, and later in life as someone who had already served as the First Lady of the United States and was called, maybe not to her liking, but became known as the First Lady of the world as well. So our segment, this segment that I'm sharing with you tonight, is particularly about 3 of the Roosevelt women. And these are Roosevelt's by marriage, including Eleanor's paternal grandmother, Martha Bullock Roosevelt, known all her life as Mittie. We're going to talk about Mittie. We're going to talk about Eleanor's mother. Let me show you Mittie. There's Mittie. We're going to talk about Eleanor's mother, a woman named Rebecca Hall Roosevelt. And we're going to talk about someone you probably know, this woman the best of these 3. This is Sara Delano Roosevelt, Eleanor's mother-in-law. So I wanted to start out, I'm a visual learner. I always let people know that. So I like to see things and be able to read things. I think that's why I enjoyed being a librarian and doing lots of research work along the way in my career. But this is a family tree of the Roosevelt Bulloch family that includes at the top Martha Bulloch, who was the wife of Theodore Roosevelt, who would become a senior once he had a son by that same name born in 1858. But Theodore Roosevelt married Martha Bulloch in 1853. They had 4 children, 2 daughters and 2 sons. The 2 daughters were on either end of the family. The 2 sons were in the middle. So we're talking about Martha Bulloch, nicknamed Mittie, and you can see under her son Elliot's name, his wife, Anna Hall, and then below Anna's name, you can see Eleanor's name. She was the only daughter of Elliot Roosevelt and his wife, Anna Hall Roosevelt. The woman who's not on this chart is Sara Delano, because she married into another branch of the Roosevelt family, the Hudson Valley branch. She was the second wife of James Roosevelt, as most of you probably know. But I did also decide to put in this slide so that you could kind of understand that Mittie, Martha Bulloch Roosevelt, Mittie was a generation older than the other 2 women we'll discuss tonight. Mittie was born in 1835. You just saw that she was married in 1853, so she was just 18 years old when she married Theodore Roosevelt. The next generation of women includes the other 2 Roosevelts by marriage that we're speaking about tonight. Sara Delano was born in 1854, and she was friendly with Mittie's older daughter, who was named, her official name was Anna, but she was called Bammy after the Italian word for little girl, bambina. So Bammy was born in 1855, just a few months after Sara Delano. They were friends. And in fact, that's how Sara Delano ended up marrying into the Roosevelt family through a connection she made at Mittie's home at a dinner party that Bammy and her mother hosted. So Sara Delano was a generation younger than Mittie, as was Anna Hall Roosevelt. She's the last name on this list, the youngest of the 2 daughters of Martha Bulloch Roosevelt and her son's 3 wives who were listed there. So Anna is the wife of Mittie's son, Elliot. Anna is the mother of Eleanor Roosevelt. Anna was born in 1863. So I hope that helps you understand a little bit and place these people in time. But let's begin by talking about Mittie, who was the matriarch of this branch of the family. As I mentioned, she was born in 1835 on July 8th, down in Georgia. She was a Southern belle. She was known as Mittie all of her life. Her mother's name was also Martha. So Mittie, the daughter, got this nickname and it stuck with her entire life. This is an interesting story that I'm going to try to explain to you how Theodore Roosevelt and Martha, known as Mittie Bulloch, met when she was just 15 years old. They first met down in Georgia. Later, they met at the home of Mittie's older half-sister. Now, hang on, because this is not easy to explain. Mittie's mother had been married twice. She lost her first husband, remarried. So Mittie had this older half-sister named Susan, who married a man from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His name was Hilborn West. He was a physician. So Dr. and Mrs. West lived in Philadelphia, but they often entertained other family members, even family members that didn't live particularly close by. They entertained Dr. West's sister, whose name was Mary West. Mary West was married to a man named Silas Roosevelt. Silas Roosevelt was the older brother of Theodore Roosevelt. And so they had a common relationship of sorts. If I understand this correctly, Mary West was not only the sister-in-law of Mittie's older half-sister, she was also a sister-in-law to Silas Roosevelt, the older brother of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt would tag along with his older brother and his sister-in-law, Mary, to go visit her brother and sister-in-law, Susan and Hilborn West, over in Philadelphia. Theodore Roosevelt heard all these stories that Susan was telling about her home down there in Georgia, where she had younger siblings still living. And Theodore Roosevelt very much wanted to know more about this entirely different lifestyle and this different place that he knew nothing about. He would find out lots about that eventually. So anyway, Theodore and Mittie came together. First, he visited her home in Georgia. She wasn't so impressed with him, but they crossed paths 2 years later out in Philadelphia at their common relatives' home there, and romance blossomed. So Theodore Roosevelt, who would become the elder or senior Theodore Roosevelt that we are talking about today, married his wife, Martha Bullock, or Mittie, at Bullock Hall down at their home in Georgia on December 22nd of 1853. Again, she was just 18 years old at the time of her marriage. They moved to New York City, and she started an entirely new life. Moved from a very southern state. Again, this was before the Civil War, but moved to an entirely different environment. But she was a lovely lady and beautiful, just admired for her ebony hair and her cream-colored complexion, and just being able to tell wonderful stories and to enchant her guests at her home that she entertained with her husband, Theodore. As I mentioned, she became the mother of 4 children. Again, 2 daughters, Anna and Corinne. And Anna was the oldest in the family. Corinne was the youngest of the children. And in the middle were her 2 sons, Theodore Roosevelt, who became the 26th president of the United States, and his younger brother, only younger by about 18 months, a man named Elliot Roosevelt, who eventually became the father of Eleanor Roosevelt. I know we're skipping way ahead here, but Martha Bullock Roosevelt, Mittie, died in New York City, very young. She died on February 14th, 1884, Valentine's Day. And I believe, of course, Barbara Sweet's little squares right on top of her age. I believe it says she was 48 years old at the time. She died the same day, some of you might realize, as another family member, Theodore Roosevelt's first wife, who was named Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt, had just given birth 2 days earlier on February 12th of 1884 to their daughter Alice. And both Mittie and who was Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's mother, and his wife died the very same day, a tragic day in that household in 1884. I'll tell you some more about Mittie, though. Again, Mittie had that nickname all of her life, and she grew up down there in Georgia with a slave child named Lavinia, who was basically assigned to her to be a playmate, to be a companion, to sleep on the floor. Lavinia would sleep on a mat on the floor next to Mittie's bed and was there to kind of run errands or do whatever Mittie wanted her to do, to play with her, to be with her, to go grab something for her. Different lifestyle, much different than what the her family would later live in New York City. Again, Mittie was highly regarded for her delicate features. Again, her ebony hair, her creamy complexion, and her just overall beauty, even by New York society, where she must have been a little bit out of place, at least at the beginning. She and her mother and her older sister, another woman named Anna, there are an awful lot of Annas in this family. Her mother and her sister came to live with the Roosevelts in New York City. I believe they lived on, I think it's West 20th Street in Manhattan. But the mother and sister, as well as Mittie herself, were sending money and medicine and bandages and all kinds of supplies during the Civil War down to family members there in Georgia to support two of her brothers who were fighting against the United States on behalf of the Confederate States of America. So they were kind of behind the scenes doing their thing to support family members and others who were not on the same side of that battle as most of the other people around her. Mittie had some issues, I guess you would call them, later in her life. She was known to wear white muslin clothing year-round, even in the winter. All summer long, it might have been fairly comfortable to wear that kind of fabric and that color. In the winter, though, she continued to wear white muslin clothing because she basically became a germaphobe later in her life. She was very afraid of dirt and catching germs and catching disease, and she changed her entire wardrobe. She, after her husband died, and he passed away, I believe in about 1876 or 77, she sort of went off the kilter for a while. Mittie, in fact, would die of typhoid fever, which was called dirty waters disease, which was kind of ironic because Mittie, even when she bathed, would use 2 tubs of water, which was probably quite extravagant. She wanted 1 tub for bathing and 1 tub for rinsing, and yet she fell victim to typhoid fever, dirty water disease, and died just 2 days after her first granddaughter, Alice Roosevelt, who became known as Alice Roosevelt Longworth, of course. Just two days after baby Alice was born, Mittie passed away. Eleanor would be born about 8 months later. Her parents were expecting her at the time of Mittie's death, but she would not arrive until October of 1884. So Eleanor never got to know that grandmother of hers. Let's move on then and talk a little bit about Eleanor's mother, a woman named Anna Rebecca Hall, from another town, not too far from all of you out there in Dutchess County or Clinton County, New York. She was born in Tivoli on the Hudson back on March 17th of 1863. She was the oldest of 6 children of her parents, Valentine and Mary Hall. She had 3 sisters, and I believe the 2 youngest in the family may have been her brothers. So she also was considered a great beauty, but her fame and her beauty was part of the New York society that she was born into, and that she was considered just one of the most beautiful young women of her time in that day and place back in the 1880s. She met and fell in love with Elliott Roosevelt, the younger son of Martha Bullock Roosevelt and her husband Theodore. They had a fairly quick courtship. They married on December 1st of 1883, and they eventually had 3 children. Their oldest daughter was, of course, Eleanor Roosevelt, that we know as Eleanor Roosevelt another Roosevelt by marriage, as Cynthia pointed out. Eleanor Roosevelt was a Roosevelt by birth and by marriage, who was born in October of 1884. Anna and Elliot also had a son that they named Elliot Jr., born, I believe that says 1889, and their younger son was named Gracie Hall Roosevelt. They called him by his middle name, Hall, which was his mother's maiden name. He was born in 1891. Sadly, Eleanor didn't know her mother very long either. She never knew her grandmother, Mittie, but even her mother passed away at a very young age on December 7th of 1892. She was just 29 years old, and she had already entrusted her mother, her 40-some-year-old widowed mother, with the care of her children because of some problems in her marriage with Elliot Roosevelt. So Eleanor lost her mother when she was just 8. And even more sad than that, within 20 months, with another year and a half plus, Anna's older son, that's Elliot Jr., and her estranged husband, Elliot, were also gone, leaving Eleanor and her baby brother, Hall, as orphans. A sad story. This is a picture of Anna Hall as a young girl, and then later on, a picture of Anna and her husband, Elliot Roosevelt. You can kind of see a resemblance, I believe, between Elliot and his older brother, Theodore. So let's talk a little bit about their family life, which I have read was described as being chaotic, not the best situation to be growing up for a little girl like Eleanor. Her father always seemed to be the more athletic and charming of the Roosevelt brothers, but he had long suffered from headaches and just maybe had seizures and was just never as well or as formally educated as his older brother, Theodore. Theodore attended Harvard University. Elliot did not attend did not have a higher education. In fact, most people thought he just seemed sort of, at a loss, sort of aimless and unpredictable in comparison to his older brother. And he simply chose to play polo and to live off his inheritance and live a different lifestyle than either his father or his older brother followed. It's interesting, though, that all the same, Sara Delano, that we'll talk about more in a few minutes, and her husband, James, knew Elliot Roosevelt. He was on the same ship with them when they were sailing to Europe for their honeymoon in 1880. And they got to know him a little bit better while they were on board ship. And by 1882, when Sarah and James had their only child, their son Franklin, they asked Elliot Roosevelt to be their son's godfather. So in 1886, Franklin would have been about 4, and Eleanor would have been about 2. Eleanor's parents, Elliot and Anna, actually brought her up to Hyde Park, New York, to James and Sara Delano Roosevelt's home, Springwood. And Franklin at 4 and Eleanor at 2 played together in the nursery that day. They met as very young children, whether they remembered that or not, but their parents were friends. And Franklin's parents had entrusted Elliot to become Franklin's godfather. According to the book, the companion book to the Ken Burns series about the Roosevelts, the companion book was written by Jeffrey Ward, a wonderful historian who's also written other books about Franklin and also Daisy Sipley and some other characters you probably know in your part of New York State. But it says that Anna Roosevelt seemed to have been completely disappointed in her daughter, almost from the very beginning. Eleanor, her baby girl, was just not as pretty as she might have expected her to have been. Her Anna's sisters and herself were considered all very beautiful, and her daughter just didn't quite live up to her expectations. She thought she was a bit solemn and very quiet, and her mother actually called her granny. You've probably heard that before. Her mother actually made light of her daughter's appearance and her demeanor in front of other people, perhaps even at that visit to James and Sara Delano Roosevelt's home in Springwood back in 1886. By 1889, Elliot had broken a leg. I think he was playing polo. I'm sorry. I think he was playing polo. He was engaged in some activity. He broke a leg. It was never properly set. It never healed right. And he had to eventually have it rebroken and worked on. And he sadly spiraled into an addiction to both alcohol and painkillers after this unfortunate accident. And it just helped continue the downfall of this young man who had such great potential and never seemed to be able to realize it. In fact, Eleanor's parents, Anna and Elliot, were married for just almost exactly 9 years before her death in December of 1892. They were married, I believe, in 1883. So almost exactly 9 years they were married, but they lived apart for quite a bit of that, at least about half of the time they were not together. They had problems in their marriage. They had problems because of Elliot's addictions, and they were apart. And Eleanor loved and adored the time that she was able to be with her father, to spend with her father. But there were lots of promises that he made to her that were never kept. Lots of talk about traveling together and being a family even after her mother passed away, and you know, all these things that they would do together. And they would raise the younger brothers, and she would, you know, take on a role similar to being a mother to her younger siblings, and it just didn't happen. Sadly, Elliot Roosevelt died in August of 1894, so Eleanor was almost 10 years old, not quite 10 years old. She's still only 9 years old. She's lost both parents. She's now living with her mother's mother, her grandmother Hall, and her life, you know, would never be what she had hoped it would be and what her father promised to make with her. Very sad. One of the quotes from the Eleanor Roosevelt Encyclopedia, one of the other volumes that I've used to help me prepare this program, is that both serenity and turmoil were in the legacy that Anna Hall Roosevelt and basically Elliot Roosevelt as well left to their daughter Eleanor. Serenity in some ways, that she had to learn to be quiet and to console herself, but there was constant turmoil in the life. It was a sad situation, a very tragic situation for this little girl. Okay. And now we're going to turn our attention to Sara Delano Roosevelt, probably the most well-known of the three women we're discussing tonight. She not only was Eleanor's mother-in-law, of course, she was the mother of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Sara was born down in Newburgh, New York, just down the road. I've driven through there, and I don't think that the home that the Delanos lived in, which I believe is pronounced Algonac, I don't believe it still stands, but that's where Sara was born in September of 1854. She was the middle child in a family of 9. She did lose some of her siblings at a young age, but she was one of the very highly regarded daughters of Warren and Catherine Delano. Her father, Warren, again, had made not one, but 2 fortunes in the China trade, trading not only in tea, but also in opium, which was entirely legal back in the day. So Sara not only lived in Newburgh and spent time there, as well as likely New York City, but she also spent time abroad in China and in Europe, and was fairly well educated for a young woman of her time. By the time she turned 26 and was still not married, she did attend a dinner party, as I mentioned earlier, with her friend Bammy Roosevelt, the older sister of Theodore and Elliot Roosevelt, did attend a dinner party. And supposedly, James Roosevelt, whose first wife had passed away several years earlier, was looking perhaps to woo Bammy, the older daughter, Mittie's older daughter, but he noticed, he met, Sara Delano caught his eye, and it was Sara Delano that James Roosevelt, at age 52, asked to marry him. She was 26 upon their wedding date, October 7th of 1880. And just a year and 3 months or so later, their only child, Franklin, was born on January 30th of 1882. Sara had a very long and difficult labor. She was advised, after the doctor had to use chloroform, which I guess was the way they handled a problem delivery back in the day. She was advised maybe she shouldn't have any other children. He was a large baby, over 10 pounds, I believe. So his parents completely doted on him. Both of them just thought, their world centered around him. And we'll talk a lot about Sara and her only child. But I do want to point out that Sara did, compared to Mittie and to Anna Roosevelt, she did live a very long and full life before she died at her home, Springwood in Hyde Park, on September 7th of 1941. She lived to be 86 years old, nearly 87. Let's talk more about Sara, though. And we'll talk first about Sara and her husband, James, and her son, FDR. And sort of from the time of FDR's birth in 1882 until he was a freshman in college at Harvard in 1900. Sorry, here we go. Sara was, again, devoted to her son. His father, likewise, spent lots and lots of time teaching him to sail, to ride horseback, to identify birds, and to collect them. Only one of each species, though. That collection is still in that front hall area of the home there in Hyde Park. And they just loved their life together on the east bank of the Hudson River there at Hyde Park. Although they did winter some in New York, and they also summered up at Campobello Island, an island that's actually in New Brunswick, Canada, but it's off the most sort of northeasternmost point in Maine. If you go all the way up to Lubec, Maine, and I did travel up there in 2009, it was a hike. And then now there's a bridge to cross over to Campobello Island. Franklin started going there as a very young child. And of course, Campobello Island would figure into his life back in 1921 when he was 39 years old. And that's where he first was felled by the effects of a virus he had picked up earlier that summer. And that's where his paralysis set in. But Campobello was a wonderful place for them to be. They spent so much time together, and they also traveled abroad quite a bit. James Roosevelt was twice the age of his bride when they married in 1880. And he was more the age of a grandfather typically would have been to Franklin. So they did travel abroad to Germany and other places to try to take the cure, to try to find a way to improve James's health. He had heart problems, and they would take a tutor along for Franklin while he was still of the age that he could be taught at home. It took a couple of extra years for Sarah, particularly, I have heard, to allow Franklin to go off to boarding school at Groton. Like most boys would have done at 12, Franklin didn't start until he was 14 years old. And then Sarah was, very upset when she heard a couple years later that Franklin was ill with scarlet fever. And, she was not to come visit. She was not to, it was very dangerous. It was contagious. So she managed to not go inside the building to visit him. She just climbed up a ladder and visited him through a window in the infirmary at Groton. She needed to check on her boy and make sure he was fine. Sadly, James Roosevelt, Franklin's father and Sarah's husband, died in December of 1900. And again, Franklin was a freshman at Harvard University in Boston that year when his father died right before Christmas. Sarah decided maybe she just should spend her winter in Boston, and maybe that would allow her to be closer to FDR, and maybe they'd be able to spend time together on weekends when he wasn't in classes. She was very close to her son. And here's some pictures of Sarah with young Franklin, and Sarah with a little bit older Franklin. At least his curls have been cut. He had long hair and wore dresses for quite a while as a young child, and then he became a young man. And here's a picture, I think one of the last pictures taken, and perhaps even up at Campobello Island, of Sarah with her husband James, who looks fairly elderly. He was 72 years old when he died in 1900. Franklin, I believe, is 18 years old there in the summer of 1900. And again, I think they're up at Campo. So by 1902, there's a different configuration in Sarah's life. There's Franklin always, but then Eleanor Roosevelt becomes part of the mix again, starting in 1902 and then continuing on for many years. The story goes that Franklin and his mother were on the train heading up from New York City to their home in Hyde Park. And on the same train heading further north up to Tivoli was Eleanor Roosevelt, who was back from her years abroad at Allenswood School in England. And Franklin bumped into Eleanor. They started talking. He brought her over to see his mother. They kind of clicked. Eleanor had come home from Allenswood School that year because she had turned 18, or was turning 18 in October, and her grandmother insisted that she make her debut in New York society. So Franklin and Eleanor began to cross paths at some of these events, which were intended for any debutante to help her find a prospective husband. Franklin even invited her to come to a football game, I believe, at Harvard. They visited Eleanor's younger brother, Hall, who was now at Groton. They visited him together. They saw each other quite a bit. And by the fall of 1903, FDR proposed to Eleanor Roosevelt. She immediately said yes. They were both sure they were in love. Sarah, however, thought they were much too young to be in love. Franklin would have only been about 21. Eleanor still was just a teenager, 19. Sarah thought, well, let's wait. Let's wait a year. Let's see, you know, let's see what happens, and, you know, let's keep this mum for a while. She even took Franklin on a cruise to the Caribbean, thinking maybe that would change the situation, but no, not so. By December of 1904, their engagement was announced publicly. And in fact, the President of the United States, who was then Uncle Theodore Roosevelt, who was Eleanor's godfather, said, if you would like to have a White House wedding, that would be okay. I think Eleanor wisely decided that she would just marry in New York City. Her cousin Alice, who was living in the White House with her parents, was not yet married. And I'm sure Eleanor thought it wiser just to marry at the home of her godmother in New York City. They did ask Uncle Teddy when he would be available to give Eleanor away in marriage. And he said, you know what, I'm going to be in town on March 17th, which was Eleanor's mother, Anna's birthday. So that was kind of sweet, but it was also the St. Patrick's Day parade that year. And so Teddy Roosevelt, the sitting president of the United States, was there to give his goddaughter away to his younger brother's godson. And they were united in marriage that day. So for the next 36 and a half or so years, Sarah, in my opinion, influenced and often tried to control many of Franklin and Eleanor's decisions, from where they would live and how they raised their children, and, you know, which opportunities Franklin would pursue, particularly in politics, because she helped fund his campaigns and his attempts to be elected to office. She even weighed in about what would happen after Franklin's relationship with Lucy Mercer came to light. She told him that she would cut him off of if he left his wife and 5 children for another woman. There would be no more funding of campaigns. There would be problems with mom. So yes, she weighed in on that. And 3 years later, after the Lucy Mercer affair came to light in 1918, by 1921, Sarah even wanted to decide some of what would happen after Franklin was stricken with polio, and where he would recover, and where, you know, what his future would hold. She thought being a country squire, just like his father, would just be fine for Franklin. So Sarah was involved from everything, including building them a townhouse, a twin townhouse, just attached to her house, her townhouse, with the addresses of 47 and 49 East 65th Street in Manhattan. She gave it to them as a Christmas present. Here's a little note and a little drawing she made for them. She wasn't sure where it would be or what the numbers would be, but she knew that they would be attached. And in fact, they had doors that opened on 3 of the 5 floors so that she could visit or come into their space at will, basically, at this home. Another couple of images here of Sarah with her young grandchildren. That's Anna Eleanor Roosevelt Franklin, and Eleanor's oldest child, their only daughter, and their son James, sitting on Mama, as Franklin would call her, or Granny's lap there. Sara Delano holding the baby with her little granddaughter, and a family picture by the time all of the Roosevelt children were born. There's Sarah also in the picture holding the youngest child, John, on her lap there. This picture would have been taken approximately, I believe, 1918, perhaps. Sarah was involved again, as I said, when decisions had to be made about this woman, Lucy Mercer. I just wanted to show you a picture, and also to let you know, I was kind of surprised. I found that the National Park Service actually has a website, a page on their website about Lucy Mercer Rutherford, if anybody wants to find out more about Lucy in that part of the the story. We're not going to go any further there, but we're going to talk more about Sara later in her life as her son conquered as best he could the effects of the polio and got active in New York state politics again in 1928 when he ran for the governorship and won not only in 1928, but also in 1930, and then won his first election to the presidency in 1932. Here are Sara and Franklin standing together, I believe, on the front porch there at Springwood, and Sara just beaming with her son in the picture on the right as well. So I'm going to check my time here, and I'm almost done here. Sara wrote a book after, whoops, let me grab it. It fell on the floor. After Franklin was elected, I actually have 2 copies of this book. This one with this dust jacket explains that for the first time, the mother of president reveals the answers not only to questions about what her son was like in his infancy and his boyhood and his youth, but also the successive steps by which he reached the president. She answers these questions not only those questions, but to many others: what sort of child he was, what his interests were as a boy, as a college student, and a man. With the understanding that only mothers have of their sons, it says Mrs. Roosevelt tells the story of her boy simply, very humanly, and with great charm. It says this is a unique book with many fine illustrations. Sara Delano Roosevelt just was in her glory with her son as president. But she passed away on September 7th of 1941, just before noon of that day, and exactly 2 weeks to the day shy of her 87th birthday. She died in bed at her home at Springwood in Hyde Park, New York. And another wonderful book that I absolutely love is No Ordinary Time by Doris Kearns Goodwin. She describes that day that Franklin had hurried up to Hyde Park, and he sat with his mother, and he was there when she died. And Doris Kearns talks about the large oak tree, largest oak tree on the entire lawn, that huge lawn at Springwood, that less than 5 minutes after Sara died, with no storm or wind or lightning to prompt it, this largest oak tree on the property simply toppled to the ground. And people said it wasn't just by chance that when Sara died, that this also happened minutes later. I'm going to close here just with a couple of things to remind you that Sara's passing on September 7th of 1941 was exactly 3 months to the day before the United States of America was attacked at Pearl Harbor by the Empire of Japan. And I also want to point out one other fact, that just 3 years, 7 months, and 5 days after Sara died at almost 87, Sara's son, FDR, would pass away at a very young age 63, down in Warm Springs, Georgia. So I've tried to tell you the story of these Roosevelt women. Here's the image of the book that I highly recommend. Again, I'm a librarian. This was published back in 1998, and it's got pictures of some of the other women that are also included in this book, but you can read there about Martha Bullock Roosevelt, Mittie, Anna Hall Roosevelt, Eleanor's mother, and Sara Delano Roosevelt, Eleanor's mother-in-law. Other books that I find very helpful and have used to prepare for tonight's presentation are here. And I hope you've read the brand new biography of Eleanor that just came out earlier this year. I want to share one more thing from David Michaelis's book, simply titled Eleanor, that kind of sums up this whole crazy, all the relationships between these Roosevelt women, and particularly Eleanor herself. It's kind of a puzzle about Eleanor Roosevelt, the only one of these women that was both a Roosevelt by birth and marriage. And it says, I think I can read this, dancing at the inaugural ball. This was Teddy Roosevelt's 1905 inauguration. And I've tried to put in parentheses in the lighter colored purple there, who they're talking about. They're talking about they, as in Franklin and Eleanor, appeared for the first time a born duo. Society editors were delighted to rack and re-rack the many billiard ball combinations in this new game. And they wrote that Miss Eleanor Roosevelt, the daughter of the president's late brother, who would have been Elliot, was to be married to the son of Mrs. James Roosevelt, they're talking about Sarah, who had been introduced to her late husband by his, as in James's fourth cousin, who was the president, Teddy's older sister, Bammy. It says that meanwhile, the prospective groom, FDR, was the godson of the late father of the bride. They're talking about the late father being Elliot, who was and FDR was a half brother to J. Roosevelt Roosevelt. That's the half brother that some of you might know as Rosie, whose daughter Helen, who was a niece of Franklin, had wed a cousin of Eleanor's, Theodore Robinson. That was Eleanor's father's younger sister's oldest son, who was also a nephew of President Theodore Roosevelt, who happened also to be the godfather to the bride, that's Eleanor, leaving one newspaper reporter to joke, "What relation will the lady be to herself after the wedding?" I just enjoyed reading that myself. It's hard to explain to other people. I hope you could follow along as I try to make sense of that. But I highly recommend that new biography. And I certainly appreciate this opportunity to share the program with you.